Hello, I'm Earl Weinberg, and this is Book Circle Presents The Cavalry Cycle. This time we're going to continue our reading of Warm Yule. Horsepower Comes Home for Christmas. He caught Jenny staring at his middle. "Sorry about the shirt," he said. "This is the largest size." She waved dismissively. "That's not it. I have to admit I was wondering about the join." "There isn't one. No seam, no stitches. It's just a hairline. I'm a unit. Ask Conker. Well, Dr. Blackholt says it's human tissue above the line and horse tissue below, but on the whole, it's all interlocked." So, of course, everyone stared at the vast horse torso laid out before them. His mother in particular looked sad. "Mom, is something wrong?" He immediately wished he'd kept still. No, I was just remembering your sweet little baby feet." Renny glanced at his hooves, then at Jenny and Claude, whose grins said, "She's gotcha." Mothers. "Well, Mum, they went a long time ago. I had big bony feet the morning I was changed. I remember specifically looking at them just before well, oh, I know, all mothers get this way, and they're very impressive hooves and quite clean. Do you shoe yourself?" she asked, clearly making a desperate search for whatever the new normal was to be. "Just started. That's why the back ones are a little crooked, I think." "How do you reach the back ones at all?" asked Claude. "In fact, how do you get to your hindquarters, period?" "Like this," Renny answered. He edged away from Conker and rolled up into a crouch, pulling his hindquarters under him so that equine body curled up like a cat poised over a mouse hole. "Then I can reach my back feet." He demonstrated by grabbing a rear hoof. Then he looked up. His friends and relations were looking at him with smiles suppressed to one degree or another, except for Grim, who was laughing silently, tongue lolling. Renny shrugged. "Everyone has to get in silly positions sometimes." "I think I shall use that in a sermon," said Father Quentin. "It does look like a hard position for shoeing a horse," Claude acknowledged. "Right now, this horse is proud to be able to shoe himself at all." He straightened out and cleared his throat. "This horse. That's why I got you together as soon as I got home. I wanted to talk about... There's another side to my transformation." He gestured along his body, human and equine. "You can see the physical change. But besides that, do I seem changed to you in personality?" He watched their reactions. "Of course not," his mother exclaimed, but the others stared back silently, and his mother did not go on. "I don't think so," Jenny said. "Renny, we can't tell," his father told him. "Not yet. For the last few months, it's just been emails and phone calls. You certainly seemed yourself then. Everything was going splendidly, wasn't it? Now you've only been back an hour or so. Isn't everything going splendidly?" A pang of worry crossed his father's face. He saw it on all of them, except Grim, who merely studied him, and suddenly realized how much they cared for him and the responsibility that put on him. No, everything is fine. I just didn't want any of you to be surprised." Grim rolled his eyes. "I don't think it's much or bad." "Renny," said Father Quentin calmly, "you are 22 and you have just joined the military. Even without miraculous cures and transformations, your personality would be changing now. We all change. What do you think has happened?" Grim, who was sitting on the couch between Mrs. Wardley and Jenny, took a long pull on his mug of cocoa, then leaned back and crossed his ankles — the feet looked like a rat's as much as anything else — in the manner of one ready to watch the show. "Well, just little things mostly, like I can't remember what it's like to have two legs or toes. And the insomnia." "You wrote about that," his mother said, nodding, "and your appetite. I've laid in plenty of oatmeal." "And smells and things," said Claude. Renny locked eyes with him briefly, but his face gave away nothing. Claude was the only one Renny had written to about his first experience smelling a mare in heat. "Oh, do you have a horse's sense of smell now?" asked Father Quentin, interested. "Not, entirely." "That sounds pretty harmless," said Jenny. "Oh yeah, I don't want to make a big deal of this, but there's some changes deeper down than insomnia and oatmeal." Your mood, his mother broke in. Renny, you seemed so happy, aren't you? Now the pang of worry crossed her face as it had his father's, and he realized how familiar it was. They had spent his whole life worrying about him. No, Mum, I am happy. Happier and for longer than ever I was before. Well, of course, said Jenny. You're not under sentence of death any longer. That's change of circumstance, not personality. I think you're right. What I was going to say was you might see some changes in my personality, but now you say you were expecting changes anyway, so I don't know what to do. He sighed. Please go back to my question, said Father Quentin. What do you think has happened, or may have happened? That your personality has become more horse-like? Yes. But horses have all sorts of personalities, Jenny said. He's a draft horse, said Grim. They're steady and patient. Jenny stared at Renny analytically. There's circumstance again. I don't know that you were notably patient before, Renny, but now you've got time. Claude had been sitting next to Jenny, his arm around her shoulder. Now he rose, glared at Renny with mock ferocity, and demanded, Were you afraid we'd be upset to find you had acquired a few horsey reflexes and, he adopted a melodramatic tone, had sunk to the level of a beast because you had become more cheerful and patient? Claude looked at Grim. Is there a spell to instill common sense? Never in 100,000 worlds, the creature muttered back. People have looked. He swigged cocoa. Renny, said Father Quentin, if I were suddenly transformed from a middle-aged man into a healthy young giant, my personality would by heaven change, and I'd give thanks for every bit of it, and expect everyone around me to do the same. Do you still love us? What? Of course. And do you still judge good and evil as you did before? Well, Renny spluttered. I think so. It hasn't come up a lot lately. Grim snorted. Then, said Quentin, you're the Renny we know, and we're glad you're happy. Jenny turned to Mrs. Wardley. Do you think he's much more patient? I've seen exactly as much of him tonight as you have, dear. He's borne with you lot pretty well, Grim observed, fevering and mocking at him when he tries to warn you things might be just a bit odder than you knew. No, Grim, Renny said. It's okay. See? Patient. Mind you, the Fae went on, turning to him, you set yourself up pretty well going on about this announcement. Renny nodded. His father had been regarding him steadily. He now asked, So it's just that you're a little more equine than we might have thought? And son, I've got to tell you, we were thinking of you as pretty equine, appearances and all. Yes, sir. I didn't mean to upset people, sir. Mr. Wardley waved this away and seemed more disconcerted by the unaccustomed sirs than anything else. And you are well and happy? Yes, Da. Let's skip over the sir. I've never been happy for so long, ever. A spasm passed over his father's face, but the man rose too fast for Renny to get a good look. Great, that's all we could ask. Let me get a fresh pot of coffee. He vanished into the kitchen. Grim hopped up and trotted along the back of the couch, passing behind Jenny and Claude, pausing to speak briefly into Father Quentin's ear, then hopped onto Renny's shoulder. Father Quentin blinked, then said to the others, As long as I'm here, I want to mention we're going caroling tomorrow night. The choir, but anyone else who wants to come too. Renny didn't catch the rest because Grim was speaking into his ear. He does not want anyone to see his face. Da? Is he crying? That, but also anger. Anger? I hear it in his breath, and I know why. You have been happy for half a year, almost without interruption. Do you know how few people, mortal or immortal, can say that? Certainly not your parents. Your father is eaten with envy just this moment and does not want others to see. He needs a little to beat it down. There, he has won. His father re-entered with a coffee pot in one hand and a tray of biscuits in the other. Here we go. The cheer sounded a little forced to Renny, but that might have been because he knew too much. Mr. Wardley put the pot and tray down on the coffee table, then sat back down next to his wife. Renny looked at his mother, who gave her husband's hand an absent-minded squeeze and continued listening to Father Quentin talk about Christmas plans. Then he looked from his mother to Grim. She too sometimes. Passions pass over a soul like storm flurries long after a life has taken a shock. Another time it might be her fighting the devils bred from her wounds, but both your parents are seasoned warriors. How do you know all this? Because I have haunted this village since before it was sundered, and before your William sent a knight to claim it, and I have listened under windows and at keyholes for all that time. Most grown-ups here know it, or guess it, my boy, and I remain unexorcised because they also know I am at least as discreet as any priest that ever heard their confessions, which I also heard. But I think you should know that just as you have 14 years of risk ahead of you and a body transformed to pay for your health, so your parents are still paying and will pay inly, in racked hearts and lost chances. You three wept together the hour you were transformed. You should do that again from time to time, though not outwardly, perhaps. Thank you, Grim. There's my wise boy. And he clapped a prickly hand on Rennie's neck like a carter petting his horse. What did you say to Father Quentin? Cover for me. He hopped from shoulder to floor, then grew into a tall Anubis figure long enough to pour himself more cocoa. Next, Conker woke and decided to settle this horse business once and for all. She drove her nose in under Rennie's upper rib cage full force for a good sniff. Renny made a noise neither horse nor man can make because you need to be punched between your upper and lower lungs to make it. This completed the process of diversion, and the evening moved on. Everyone agreed to take part in the caroling next night. Father Quentin said the choir mistress would be delighted with Rennie's new resonance and left with Grim soon thereafter. Jenny and Claude visited for a couple of hours, then went off to supper. Renny had supper at home for the first time since his transformation, a pleasant and normal one preceded by large helpings of oatmeal. As was normal for him now, Renny was not at all sleepy when his parents went to bed. New problem. Until now, Renny had spent his insomniac nights with the other recruits. Some chatted in undertones, or read or did homework, as others dozed off and woke. This time he was alone. He read books he hadn't seen in months. He watched a snowfall start up. He managed 2 hours of sleep. He woke up and watched the snowfall end. He snuck downstairs. A 1-ton animal can sneak if he moves very slowly, and watched TV at low volume. He wandered the house, studying his home from his new height. The house was hot. He put on his jacket and saddle blanket, then went outside to find something to do. It was still dark when Mrs. Faber looked out her window and remarked, "Frank, there's a centaur shoveling our front walk." "What, Renny Wardley? How many centaurs do we know?" Fair point. They had not been in the crowd around the horse trailer yesterday evening, so this was the first time they had seen him as a centaur, but they had known him all his life. Mrs. Faber opened the kitchen door and called, "Thank you, Renny, that's very sweet of you. Come in and have some cocoa." Renny had looked up, smiled, and tipped his cowboy hat to her when the door opened. He now approached. As he loomed up in perspective, Mrs. Faber wondered if inviting him in had been wise. But he ducked through the door with practiced ease, neatly knocking the snow off his hooves on the doorstep as he did so. Soon he was curled up on the kitchen floor, still taller than Mr. Faber, sipping cocoa from the double-sized mug and telling them about cavalry training. "They certainly seem to keep you busy," said Mrs. Faber after hearing about agility class, horse care, health and first aid, packing and camping, wilderness survival, endurance runs, strength training, archery and marksmanship, and riding classes as seen from the underside of the saddle, all skills to make one a useful monster to take on an expedition to the out zones. Renny nodded. Then there are the lectures in things like history and cosmography and the individual study projects. Scholars on hooves is what Captain Fletcher says we're to be. I'm studying to be a medic. Mrs. Faber nodded. That would be very natural, given Rennie's background. "Strength training, did you say?" asked Mr. Faber. "Good Lord, are your mates all as big as you?" "No, sir, I'm the biggest." He grinned shyly. "I'm a draft horse. The others are Mustangs or Arabians or something. Well, Darnley's a little big for that. The transformation works along the lines of your original form. So, for instance, one guy was blonde and he came out Palomino. I already had black hair and was tall, so I have a black coat, and I'm big. But you were tall and thin, dear, said Mrs. Faber. That must have been the CF, ma'am. I guess the skinny went away with the CF. Well, what a blessing it did. Mrs. Faber looked over the beast in her kitchen for traces of the Renny she had known. It was desirable to remind herself that this was Renny. Otherwise, it was a very large, very strange creature. The face had filled out, but was still recognizable under the beard. The hands no longer had the blunted fingers of a CF victim, but now looked like his father's. The voice was not much changed, though there was an added ring to it. I think they need to keep us busy, ma'am, he reflected. I found out why last night. For the first time since I changed, I didn't have anything to do. Old me would have just rested. Now I can't stand it. I went out around 3 and walked around the village. Mr. and Mrs. Faber compared notes later and found they had both wondered if anyone had waked to the clopping of hooves and looked out the window. It all looked very odd, Renny reflected. Do you have enhanced night vision now? Mr. Faber asked. No, I was just seeing everything from 2 feet further up. I went to all my old hangouts. They look really strange in the middle of the night. I'll have to try again with Jenny and Claude in the daylight. Mrs. Faber surprised herself by laying her hand on Rennie's. I did something like that the first time I came back from college. Those places look strange even in daylight and from your usual height. Renny smiled at her. I see. Well, I went round the village again and looked around again, and then I thought I'd find something useful to do. Is that when you started shoveling walks? Asked Mr. Faber, peering out the window where dawn was starting. Yes, sir. Mr. Faber looked over the neighborhood. Let's see, you did yours and ours, 2 on each side of our house, including yours, and the 5 across the road. Do you ever get tired now, Renny? Oh, yes, sir. You should see me puff after an endurance run. Being big's no help then. Mr. Faber glanced out the window again. Here come Claude and Jenny bright and early. They must be coming to see you, Mrs. Faber said, but Renny was already rising. You have plans with them? Asked Mr. Faber. Yes, but they don't know it yet. I'm going to make them breakfast, them and my parents. Mrs. Faber looked at the fraction of the kitchen Renny was not filling. She knew the Wardleys' kitchen was no bigger. Oh, that's nice. Why? To prove a point. My mates back at the base said I could only use a kitchen by leaning through the window. That was before I laid down the scores I did in agility. Do you want to come too? The more people there are, the more it's like cooking for the cavalry. After a hearty breakfast for 7 of cheese omelets, sausage, and toast with plenty of oatmeal any way you liked it, the Wardleys and the Fabers chatted in the living room while the young people cleaned up. He seems to be flourishing, Mrs. Faber said. Yes, I think so, said Mrs. Wardley. You know, he got us quite worked up last night, trying to warn us about some changes in him that he was afraid would upset us. It amounted to the fact that he felt unexpectedly peaceful. He thought we'd find it strange. Then I heard him rambling around the house all night. He was trying to be quiet, of course. It never entered his head to warn us that he'd now be so hard to keep up with. In the kitchen, Jenny and Claude had just agreed to revisit old haunts with Renny, though the nostalgia exercise was really just a way to visit with Renny, so far as they were concerned. And you shoveled walks in the middle of the night just for something to do? Claude asked. Partly. I admit I'm also trying to make a good impression. I know some people look at the transformation as this twisted thing the gentry does with spare sons to show off or score points with the crown. Thought I'd throw some weight the other way. Claude eyed his friend. Didn't you rack up your back? I mean, I know you're strong and tough and so on, but you have to lean over a lot further than a human. A man simple, I mean. That being the polite way to continue including Renny as human. I bow a little at the forelegs with each pitch. It's still got to work the hell out of that big tendon, said Jenny. What tendon? The one on your spine where the horse neck turns into your waist. I can see it running out from under your shirt. Actually, the tendon was not very visible at the moment. Renny had moved the table aside and was sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor, rump down, forelegs up. This straightened his back and brought the tendon down. Experimentally, he stood and admitted to some stiffness in the small of his human back. Jenny, who with Claude was wedged between Renny and the counter, reached over and began shifting, pummeling, and generally massaging the tendon. For old time's sake, she remarked. She and Claude had spent considerable time drumming and massaging Rennie's back to loosen the mucus clogging his lungs. Renny had not thought his new body had any surprises left for him, but the contented grunt he now gave came out like the rumble of a diesel engine given with his horse chest much more than with his human one. "I didn't know centaurs purred," Jenny said. This one does. "Help me, Claude. It's like massaging a sapling." Claude joined in with greater force, though somehow this wasn't as much fun. Jenny worked up the tendon under his t-shirt and over the hairline to where he was still human. Her hands were warm and both soft and strong, and Rennie's legs buckled and he sat down. "Thanks," said Jenny, and "That's better," said Claude. They attacked his spine at the new angle. Renny replied with a nod and another diesel grunt, but his mind was far away and racing farther. So this was what desire was like. Not mere arousal as from a whiff of mare, not playful imagining. He had been strong enough for that when he was ill and human, but he had been too exhausted by the illness for much more. Now he was alive to the attraction of a particular person, wanted to embrace and kiss this particular person, who was Jenny, his childhood friend, engaged to Claude, also his childhood friend. And the same change that gave him the strength to desire also frustrated it. But that hardly mattered, since her love, that kind of love, was already given elsewhere, never in the cards. Damn. Back up, back up. This should be way easier than all those nights you thought you were 5 seconds away from the dark and backed away to look at your life and reckon up a final tally. Now you know you can feel this. You are one step less crippled. But who could you feel this for? Well, now you have time to find out. As much time as anyone, and more than most. He felt his friend's hands slacken, then renew their efforts. They were tiring. "Thanks, guys," he said, rising and ending the back rub. "That felt great." "You are one solid beast, my man," said Claude, flapping his hands to restore circulation. Renny grinned. This was comfortable territory. "I love it. I used to feel like I could wink out any moment. If you winked out now, there would be a lot of displaced air." They decided to turn their nostalgia tour into Christmas shopping, so Renny added his harness and empty packs to his hat and jacket. "You don't mind being a beast of burden?" Jenny asked. "Nope, it's part of what I signed on for. Here's one very expensive spell to fix your health. Now make yourself useful. It's a fair deal." Last night's snowfall had left Limstow decoratively iced. Renny paced down the street, taking in the new angle again, and found Jenny and Claude flanking him, each with a hand resting companionably on his withers. "That's nice," he said after a bit of thought, nodding to right and left. "We couldn't have done that before, arms around each other's shoulders. We'd have looked like we were starting a number from a musical. But it seems to work this way." He saw Claude and Jenny exchange glances over his bow, so to speak. "It's deliberate," Jenny said. "When you danced with us last night, fresh off the trailer, it was fun, but it was also very startling. Claude and I talked about it and decided we should make a deliberate effort to get used to your new shape." Renny cocked his head. "To touch me? Were you looking for a chance to give me that back rub?" Jenny laughed. Claude said, "Not the back rub specifically, but we were looking for chances like that." "Well," Renny silently congratulated himself on keeping his recent thoughts to himself. "Thank you. A great deal." They felt an otherwise private chuckle pass under their hands. "If you like, I can give everyone rides on Christmas morning. That ought to fit in with your program." "Really?" exclaimed Jenny. "Of course, really. Remember the emails I sent about working with the standard cavalry? The jockeys and the pony boys working together, making ourselves useful." "You're on," said Claude. And we'll continue with Rennie's visit home next time.